Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks Preet for joining us and sharing your views. So I'd like to ask just a few questions for the first half hour, and then we'll kind of open it up for general Q&A from the students and visitors. So Preet, I think one thing MBA students sometimes don't know is that you manage a large organization with a huge budget, many employees. And also the employees that you have, these assistant U.S. attorneys, have a lot of power and discretion. So just want to kind of kick off, if you can share just kind of your views of management, how you manage a large organization, how you select for people to ensure that they're going to be ethical and kind of make sure the organization is doing what it should be doing.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. This is a particularly comfortable chair, I realize. So I apologize if I get too comfortable. People sometimes ask me from time to time, given what we do, and we prosecute a lot of kinds of cases, including white-collar cases. Some, I hate to say it, alums of this very institution have been prosecuted. And people say, "No, why do you come and speak to groups like this?" And I say it's because I really, really like the sound of nervous laughter. Thank you. So people may not fully appreciate that, as we were talking about before we came out here, that I'm a lawyer and a prosecutor, and that's a large part of my job, but it probably isn't even the biggest part of my job. I run an institution, like a lot of you will eventually, maybe very soon. We have 450 employees, thereabouts. We have personnel issues we have to deal with. I have a budget I have to deal with. I have 4 different locations. I hire on a regular basis. We have a lot of turnover. So a large part of my job is the same kind of job that any CEO of a company has, which is to make sure that you're motivating people, you're inspiring them, you're retaining them, you're trying to get them to do the right thing, you're trying to get them to row in the same direction and advance the mission of the office. Now, it turns out that the mission of our office is and is always supposed to be not the manufacture of widgets or the provision of some service other than to the taxpayers who pay our salary, and that is to make sure that we ensure that justice is done. And that doesn't mean just notching victories on your belt and putting people in prison, but making sure that the right thing is done in every case for the right reasons all the time. And so my brother is a business person and ran a company and is much wealthier than I am. Sold his business to Amazon for $500 million, so he buys dinner now when we go out. But as part of the question you're asking, he and I have gotten together a lot, and he ran a fairly sizable company and starting a new one now, that a lot of the things that we think about and care about are the same. As I mentioned, motivating people and getting people to do the right thing. So the most important thing, I think, and I think most business people will tell you this, and I learned it when I took over in my job, is to hire the right people. When we get to, hopefully, we'll talk a little bit about culture and ethical culture and creative culture. That's all about the people you bring in. There's no system that can do the job. There's no structure that can do the job unless you have the people in the right place. And so I think about my job sometimes as a lawyer who's involved as a CEO of an institution, sort of a business, and sometimes in the reverse. And I think the same thing about the law. You can't have a good legal structure and you can't have justice being done no matter how good your laws are as a society, or how good your ethical code is as a company, or your strategy is as a company, unless the people who are executing those things understand it, care about it, and are doing it for the right reason. So the number one thing is the people you hire and the people you promote.
So just building on that, one thing you've mentioned is that people that salivate of putting, Charlie Sheen and Michael Douglas in handcuffs are not the right people to be U.S. attorneys, because those aren't people who are interested in justice.
Yeah, they're actors, right?
Right, just when they kind of see the movie Wall Street, that's what they dream about. Those aren't kind of the right people to hire. So just, and part of that is the fit of what you care about and what kind of job you want. So what advice would you give to our students on how they select a job and what kind of career that they're going to do?
Yeah, so I've spoken a lot at business schools, including much lesser business schools than this one, and that was a compliment to the school. And I'm astonished sometimes when I hear people ask, the question about where you should go and whether or not you should focus more on how much money you can make at a place. Now, obviously, it's important to think about what the terms are going to be in your employment, and you want to make a good living and you want to do a good job. You also want to think about places where you can grow. You also want to think about places where you can learn. My concern, not on the part just of students who are coming out of one of the best business schools in the world, but also for everyone, for politicians, for prosecutors, for leaders of every kind, is that everyone is always thinking too often about the next day or the current fiscal year or the current budget year for themselves personally and are not thinking about the long run. And so, relevant to my job, I say to people, you should think about the reputation for ethics and integrity of the place you go. And I know that some people sometimes roll their eyes and they say, well, that's sort of a pie-in-the-sky view. It's not my problem. I'm going to be a small person going to a trading firm or going to a financial institution of some sort. That's really not my problem. And I beg to differ with that. I think you should think about what the reputation for honesty is, not only because it's better to work in a place that is like that and has a good reputation, but also because you're taking less risk, less long-term risk with your current employment. Just ask the people who worked at the Galleon Group. And that's a hedge fund that ended up going under because a number of people from that firm were convicted of insider trading offenses. And I believe it to be true that people knew that there was something off about the reputation of that place compared to other places. And there are a lot of people at that place who didn't do anything wrong, who didn't commit any crime, but they now have on their resume the unfortunate taint of having worked at a place where there were bad apples. So I don't come here to lecture about morality and ethics, but to also remind you that those are issues of risk that you have to deal with. I assume that you think all the time about risk and cost-benefit analysis because that's what you do at business school. But sometimes ethical considerations are also important in that regard too. I also think it's the case that the companies, if you cared about, and I know that in Northern California people care a lot about these things, about the ethic of a place and the mission of a company and a business. If everybody cared, if the labor market cared, and you're the labor market, you're the premier labor market for business in the country and in the world, if you cared about those things, then companies would care more about making sure that they're doing things by the book and being straight up. So I'll stop there.
So what are some specific things to look for? Just as like a personal example, my first job out of college was at a New York financial institution with the initials GS. And at the time, they were considered to be
Let's talk after this.
The most, sure, they were considered to be the most up and up firm in terms of kind of the reputation, what the prosecutions looked like in the 80s and 90s, and so it's hard to project. And they got in some trouble in recent times. So what are some specific red flags you would advise the students to look for if they're interested in working for an ethical organization?
I'll tell you an easy one. The interview process is a two-way street. And I had somebody come up to me after I talked to a business class like this one, said, it was a couple of years ago, and said he'd interviewed at 12 or 13 different firms on Wall Street, and only one firm asked any question that suggested to the applicant that the firm cared about the applicant's ethics or the firm cared about what the applicant thought of the firm's ethics. And I said, where are you going to work? And he said, I'm going to go work at that firm. And I said, that's a great thing. You should use the interview process, wherever you go, to ask questions of your own. And if you ask a question about how they think about ethics and how they think about integrity and how they think about reputation and how they think about the long term, you'll learn a lot from your question, even if you get sort of a pat answer. I'm a big fan of asking questions. I know people say you don't do this in cross-examination of a witness on the witness stand, but outside of that context, I'm a fan of asking questions, even if you know what the answer is going to be, because you learn a lot, and a lot of what you're going to be doing is understanding people, right, as leaders. You learn a lot from how long it takes them to answer it, how uncomfortable they are in how they answer the question, how long it takes them to answer the question. And I give the same advice to business people too. If somebody asks you the question, and when you're hiring, by the way, so soon you're going to be hiring yourselves, you want to perpetuate the kind of integrity and ethics of the institution that presumably you went to. And if you, when you're hiring somebody, ask a question like, here's my favorite question. I don't think anybody ever asks, at least I've never heard anybody asking it at a trading firm. Let me just ask you the question. Suppose you come to the firm, and 6 months from now, you say to the applicant, you have reason to believe, you're not sure, but you have reason to believe that the person sitting 2 doors down from you maybe is illegally trading in inside information. What do you do? Now, you will learn, there's no perfectly correct answer to that question, which might surprise you given what I do for a living. But you will learn about how that person reasons morally. You will learn if that person too quickly says, well, I would absolutely report to the CEO of the company, and I would call the SEC, because that's BS. People are not likely to so quickly be able to make that decision. And even though it might sound odd to you for me to say it, a person who so blithely and quickly says that they'd immediately turn in a coworker without full knowledge is not someone you want to hire either. But you're also going to see if someone seems uncomfortable. You're going to see if somebody thinks the answer that you want me to give you is that it's none of my business, and if I don't have proof beyond a reasonable doubt, I'm going to keep my mouth shut. You don't want to hire that person either. So I think in the hiring process, in both directions, if people pay attention and pick up normal human cues about who is likely to do the right thing when presented with controversy or presented with a crisis, you want to work for those people.
Great. Just want to pivot a little bit, but stay on this topic of kind of money as a motivator. So you've kind of prosecuted very prominent people. One, I'll just give an example, is the former McKinsey managing director, Raja Gupta, as Dean Rajan mentioned. Growing up as an Indian American, he was an idol in a lot of ways. Basically became the head of an old white shoe consulting firm, the most prestigious consulting firm out there. This person was very wealthy. Many of the people that you've prosecuted are wealthy before engaging in unethical activity. Why do you think such accomplished people cross the ethical line to make money, given that that really shouldn't be a motivator? What are your thoughts on that, given all the experiences you've had with these kinds of folks?
Yeah, I don't know. I get asked that question a lot, and I think it's different for different people. I think some people can't help themselves. I think some people are inherently bad people and inherently corrupt people. The interesting thing about the example you give is it's one thing if you ask the question, why do people break the law who should know better to make money? A lot of the people we prosecuted, including the one you mentioned, is not somebody who was on food stamps and needed to make money to survive. We're talking about people, many of them, who had more money than you can spend in a lifetime, more accolades than you could ever put on your wall in a lifetime. Why is it, that's why it's a great question, why is it that they were engaged in absurd criminal activity? And people speculate, as psychologists do, that often it's the case that people are not, it's not about making that extra dollar, but it's about power, and it's about becoming even with other people who are in the class just above you. I mean, it's common in the United States to talk about the phenomenon of keeping up with the Joneses, but there are different classes of Joneses everywhere in the world. It happens, in the neighborhood where I grew up in New Jersey, where it was mostly middle class, and apparently, as I've discovered in the last few years, it happens at the absolute upper echelons of wealth and power. And that's all speculation. I don't know. The thing that is important for us to communicate, and for me to make sure that everybody understands, is it's really not worth it. And it's astonishing to me that there are people who know better and know so much, who put their liberty at risk and put their reputations at risk when they didn't need the money. So if you have answers to the question, I'd be happy to hear what you think.
Well, here's kind of one other thought. So one answer that you gave is the difference between relative wealth and absolute wealth. Another theory could be that when you get into these high positions of power, just something psychologically is that you don't think the rules apply to you anymore. Or that you don't even believe you're doing anything wrong, or that you're above these simple things called legal institutions. Do you think that plays into a role where it's not even a cost-benefit calculation, it's just...
Yeah, look, I think there's an arrogance. So there's a lot of arrogance, both at in the public corruption area and in the corporate corruption area, as I think was mentioned in the intro. We've been charging a number of politicians in New York and convicting them that people think the rules don't apply to them. People think that they're very clever and they can get away with it. I think there's also a little bit of the fault in some areas can fall on the shoulders of prosecutors and regulators, because if for a long period of time nobody's enforcing something, a combination of arrogance and greed and aspiration to power and wealth combined with a lack of enforcement gets people to think, well, not only am I more clever, not only is it okay for me, but no one's going to do anything about it anyway. And the worst thing that's going to happen is I get a fine and I maybe have to disgorge some of my profits, so my cost-benefit analysis tells me I might as well engage in the fraud because I'll probably keep it all, and if not, it was not a bad risk like some other risks that I take. And so part of our job is to disabuse people of that calculus.
So if you have a few minutes here to disabuse audiences like this, one thing to say is it's not worth it, it's not worth the risk. If you could if you had 2 minutes to kind of build upon that, either stories of people that that they kind of realized after the fact it wasn't worth it, that might kind of drill that home, what would you say?
Yeah, so I say this all the time, and when I come to speak to groups like this, it's not only sort of a scared straight program for white-collar folks, although it's turning into that, and it's not just, and the people who laugh loudest are the ones I pay attention to. And it's not just to direct my words of caution, and maybe admonition to the 2 or 3 of you in this room who, statistically speaking, are likely to commit serious securities fraud. although I know who you are. And we will be following you after the program. It's really, and this goes directly to your question, it's really to direct my words and cautions to the ears of the vast majority, and I'm sure everyone in this room, of the people who are good and honorable and honest and ethical and believe themselves to be so and want to do the right thing and graduate from business school wanting to do the right thing. And some of the people you mentioned, I believe, had that view and had that view for a long time, and who go to companies wanting to do the right thing, and then something happens along the way, not necessarily because they're doing the wrong thing, but they see other things happening and they don't do anything about it. I think the biggest problem of institutions, not just financial institutions or companies that make products or that provide services, but universities also, and U.S. attorneys' offices also, and legislatures also, is that bad things happen when the vast majority of good people are apathetic and stand by and let bad things happen. That's why you have Penn State. That's why you have problems in sports leagues that we've been talking about a lot in the national media lately. And there's nothing you can do about the 2 or 3, right? Statistically speaking, there's always going to be people who are going to do bad things and whose parents didn't teach them well, I suppose. But you can survive that so long as all the good people, when they're in that situation, have the courage and the fortitude to say something and then walk away, or say something and fix the thing. And it's not easy. The biggest problem I've found in prosecuting cases, and the biggest regret you have when we come in basically forensically, and the fraud is already, by the time we are involved, by the way, it's terrible for everybody. Because the regulators have failed, the internal controls of the company has failed, and people are being led away in handcuffs, and the company may collapse. But for years before that, they were good people, or reasonably good people, who knew at Galleon that something was fishy, who knew at Madoff Securities that something was fishy, who knew at Penn State that young boys were being raped, perhaps. And the great tragedy and regret you have is that those people didn't do anything about it. And so the one thing I would say to people like you in this room, who are all of good faith and goodwill and want to do the right thing, I absolutely believe that. Don't let yourself ever be derailed from that yourself personally, but more importantly, don't let the institution be derailed by bad people who are trying to bring it down, because A, it's the wrong thing to do, and B, it's going to inure to your detriment also.
So sometimes there's career risks at doing that, right? That we
Yes.
know that intellectually it's the right thing to do, but we're saying I have a spouse, I have kids, we have a mortgage payment. There's going to be career risks if I kind of stand up for what's right. So what kind of advice would you give in saying in the long run it's still the right thing to do, even though there might be short-run career risks?
It's not easy. I don't want you to think Preet Bharara parachutes in and he says quit when you have a mortgage to pay. It's not easy. There's a reason why, by the way, there are 2 different laws in the United States, the False Claims Act and Dodd-Frank, which incentivize whistleblowers to come forward by paying them a percentage of the money that the government recovers, which would seem to be crazy if everyone was ethical and trying to do the right thing and sounding the alarm bell when bad things are happening. And the reason you have that is because it's difficult as a psychological and human matter. People, there are movies about people who are ostracized and books written about people who are ostracized who rightly blow the whistle. And so the only thing you can do is, I think, be aware of that all the time. Think about the lessons that you've learned about bad things that happen to institutions and banks going under and people being harmed physically and otherwise and institutions failing because you don't do something about it. Now, in the moment, it's not always so easy to do, but there are things you can think about doing in the initial instance. As an initial matter, don't just turn your head away. I'm not saying necessarily that the first moment you feel that there's a whiff of something bad that's going on, that you immediately go on 60 Minutes. But it does mean you don't just have a drink and go to bed. You think about it. You talk to somebody about it. You talk to a friend about it. You talk to maybe a law school friend about it. You talk to a colleague. You do something and you elevate it somehow, because chances are other people think it too. And then it becomes easier if you have a group of people who say, it's hard to go into the boss's office alone. It's easier to go if there are 2 of you. It's easier still if there are 3 of you. And who knows, maybe your immediate supervisor also has that problem, and it will take you as the person of courage to finally provoke something that changes. And the other point on that I want to make is, another problem I think on the part of young people who are very smart and talented and want to do the right thing, like everyone in this room, is that you arrive at a new place, you don't know what the policies are, you're not expert in the law, you're not expert in the regulation, and something strikes you as fishy. And I think this happens over and over again. And one way you excuse not doing anything about it is you say to yourself, well, what do I know? And it's not always. It's partly maybe you think, I don't want to get in trouble, and I don't want to be ostracized, and I don't want to get fired, and I don't want to be a troublemaker. But often, and maybe this is a self-rationalization, but I think sometimes it's honest, you think, well, what do I know? These are smart people. They seem quite nice. If they think it's okay, then they must be right. And that's the moment where I want you to think about this. You folks are at Stanford Business School. You're among the smartest, most educated, most mature people in the country. I'm willing to bet you a lot of money that if one day, a year from now or 3 years from now, you think something fishy is going on, you're probably right. And you need to trust your instinct for that, because that's often not about the particular regulation and the subpart of the third regulation that just got enacted. It's not about that. I'm talking about when you think people are acting in a morally, and that's why I'm using the funny word, fishy, are acting in a fishy way, you are almost always going to be right about that, and you should pay attention to the voice in your head that says something fishy is going on here, and don't excuse inaction because you think, well, I'm the new guy and I don't really know all the rules.
I just want to kind of transition to kind of ethical decisions that business people make to kind of ethical decisions that U.S. attorneys make. Madhav listed a bunch of things your office is doing. I don't even know how you sleep, or you sleep at all. So in addition to terrorism, financial crime, political corruption has been a major focus of the Southern District's work. So you've sought convictions of both Democratic and Republican politicians. U.S. attorneys, it's a very interesting office. It's a political appointed office, but they're supposed to be non-political in their actions. If people remember, a few years ago, this was a big issue in the Bush administration's Justice Department. And you think about people who have kind of been aggressive at rooting out political corruption and those who haven't, and what the career awards are. Give an example of 2001, I think both Patrick Fitzgerald and Chris Christie were appointed as U.S. attorneys. I think I'm getting that right. I think most people in this room know who Chris Christie is. I doubt that many people remember who Patrick Fitzgerald was. So I guess given that there are some career motivations going forward, how do you develop the courage personally and the conviction to go after both Republicans and Democrats who politically appointed you?
So I don't think about it that way. You go after people without fear or favor, without reference to what political ideology they espouse, what political ideology you espouse, whether they're rich or poor, powerful or not powerful. You mentioned, by the way, the U.S. attorney firings, and I ran that investigation actually in the Senate. It taught me a lot of things, that you can't politicize justice. There's enough, even as we speak, a regret I have is that there's a lot of mistrust of law enforcement and a healthy mistrust of government, and particularly people who have a lot of power over people's lives and power over people's liberty, like the FBI has, like U.S. attorneys have, is very important and good, and part of why this country is a great country, because you keep re-examining these things. But it becomes a terrible thing to the institution of justice in the country if people get a whiff that someone is deciding to prosecute one party or another. Now, over time, I've been accused of all those things. I've been accused of being anti-black because we arrested an African-American person who was prominent. I've been accused of being anti-Russian. I'm actually banned from Russia. That's actually a fact. I've been accused of being anti-Asian because we went after an Asian politician. And I've been accused, as some of you may know, of being anti-Indian, even though my recollection is that I was born in India. So, and at one point accused of targeting Republicans, and another point accused of all sorts of different things. Over time, if you have a long enough tenure, you can show people that if you can be accused by every ethnic group, every demographic group, every political group, that maybe you're not anti any particular group, you're just anti-crime, which I like to think that we are. And so, for us, it's not a question of being fearful about going after a Democrat or Republican. You go after the people you think are guilty of crimes, and that's what enhances people's, I think, faith in the system.
So two other types of crimes that you've gone after are financial fraud and cybercrime. And these are very unique types of crime in that the people that commit them are highly sophisticated, and they tend to be always one step ahead of regulatory agencies, et cetera, which are always struggling to catch up. Maybe you can kind of speak to this kind of sophistication issue, especially when it comes to not only prosecuting the crime, but also identifying it and deterring it. And just kind of some of the challenges you faced, how we should do better as society dealing with this type of crime.
Yeah. Look, it's a very hard thing, and the world is changing, and part of the reason I like coming to Northern California and to Stanford is to talk about the cyber issue. The first time I came out, I did a whole session with Professor Grunfest talking about the issues of cybercrime. It's nice that it's now getting the kind of attention that I think it deserves. The president talks about it. The president was talking about it here, I think a week ago, right? And all the cabinet secretaries are talking about it. But it's difficult to stay ahead. I often joke, people ask me, what does Preet mean? It's an interesting name. Obviously, I tell them I'm from India. And Preet is, in fact, ancient Sanskrit for cyber fighter. So it's a great coincidence. The problem, though, is that Bharara is also ancient Sanskrit for could you help me turn on my computer? So joking aside, there's that, it sort of encapsulates the problem for law enforcement, right? We have really, really smart people who care about the issue in the FBI and the Secret Service and other places, and really smart prosecutors, particularly people who are younger, who are a little bit more familiar with how computers work and how the internet works and how cybercrime works. But then you also have incredibly sophisticated people who are trying to take down networks and who are trying to take down infrastructure and trying to destroy America, or at least on the part of some folks, just steal all your bank accounts, steal money out of your bank accounts. So there's no easy answer in the few minutes that we have to talk about how you deal with that, but you deal with that in the same way you deal with any other crisis that comes about. In the same way, it's not that different from how we try to deal with terrorism, particularly after 9/11. You try to develop additional capacity. You try to, going back to the thing I said at the beginning, you try to hire really smart people who know what they're talking about. You try to get people from industry to come back. Part of the reason I like to come out here also, further to what I said before, is to talk to people who know these things and build partnerships between the government and the private sector, and people who are much, much more attuned to how to keep networks secure and how to keep computers secure, and not think that you know everything. I mean, it's a humbling thing for the government. And people think the people in the government walk around thinking they know everything. Maybe some do, but to the extent that they ever thought that, they think that less now, because the threat is so difficult and so complicated, not only because it's difficult and it's new stuff and it involves technology, which always freaks out older people from the government. It also involves people who are perpetrating offenses who are not only behind the anonymity of the internet, but also at a great geographic remove, often thousands and thousands of miles away. I don't think there's any challenge that's more difficult and worrisome than the cyber challenge.
I just want to end with a couple of kind of very broad questions that I think the students are very interested in. So one is, when you see kind of business role models, I think particularly in finance, a question kind of comes about, do I have to choose between being a successful person and being an ethical person? Do you think this is a legitimate question, or is this a false dichotomy, even though a lot of students think that there's a line between choosing levels of success and levels of ethics?
Yeah, I think it's a false choice. I think, further to what I said before, that if you're thinking in the longer term, right, then you can and should do both things. It always pains someone to give up $1 today because they don't know for a fact they're going to make up that dollar the next week by turning down, a questionable business deal or choosing not to engage in a questionable transaction. But I really do think, based on my experience, that to do the right thing all the time is what is ultimately going to give you the reputation that will bring you more riches, both reputationally and financially, than you could possibly imagine. It just is always true. Going back to a question you asked me a minute ago about how you choose to take things on, there are people who I admire who did difficult things. One of them is the current FBI director, who at a time when he's a Republican and was out of office, testified very dramatically in the Senate at a hearing that I arranged about what had gone on with respect to the terrorist surveillance program, and stopped the White House counsel at the time, Alberto Gonzales, from overturning a decision that Jim Comey had made when he was the acting attorney general. And it's very convoluted. But the point is that in the moment, he did the right thing and testified about something that was very important. And probably at the moment he did that, thought, this is not going to be great for anything I might want to do in the public in my future again. Mary Jo White, and he's now the FBI director. Mary Jo White, who hired me as the U.S. attorney, investigated the president who appointed her after Mark Rich was pardoned by President Clinton. Also probably thought this is the right thing to do because this is my job. And it's not going to further any career prospect I have with the government or to be appointed to anything in the future again. She's now the chairwoman of the SEC. I'm not saying that you do things for those reasons, but I just find over time that if you act with integrity and you take risk, not because you're trying to game anything, but it's the right thing to do, people generally will recognize that. And I think that's true in government, I think that's true in business. And over the long term, people are going to trust you to engage in business deals with you. And if they think you're always have some angle, and you're always trying to get over on somebody, in the long term, that hurts your earning potential. I really think that that's true. And so you shouldn't have to choose between those two things.
Last question before I open it up to the floor is this kind of idea of corporate culture. You've written about it, you've spoken about it. It's just a very nebulous thing to me. It's a very vague concept, but I think it is very important. So I agree with all the stuff you've written. In a more concrete sense, as these students, a lot of them go and start companies, they have to kind of develop what the culture of their firms are going to be. What specific aspects of corporate culture do you think are crucial to building an ethical organization? How should they go about thinking what aspects of their firm promote a good culture?
Yeah. So I've mentioned one already, and a concern I have about a culture of silence that occurs at firms, where you have an environment in which bad things may be happening, but the culture is such that people don't feel comfortable coming forward. And you need to have a place when you're in charge of it, or whatever subdivision you end up being in charge of. You want to make sure that if something bad is happening, whether it's related to an ethical problem or any other problem for that matter, I mean, we tend to overly separate issues of ethics and issues of business and other business risk. You want to make sure that if there's a competitor who's making a better widget than you are, that the boss doesn't know about, that you don't know about as the boss because you're not paying attention, that someone is not afraid of coming into your office and saying, by the way, we're going to have a big competition problem from these other widget makers because they're making cooler widgets than we are. It's called the iWidget 6, and it's going to crush us if you're at BlackBerry, for example. In the same way, you want to create a culture in which people are going to come and tell you, I have a little bit of a concern that we have this unit that's playing fast and loose. And one day the SEC is going to come down on us like a ton of bricks. So you want to create a culture in which that happens. But the corollary to that is on the silence issue is you want to make sure you work in a place, and that you perpetuate this, you work in a place where people not only come forward, but someone does something about it. I think that's incredibly important. I think you said culture is a nebulous thing. I think it is. In the same way that it's hard to define what integrity is. It's hard to define what judgment is. I've tried for a long time. It's a lot of different things. In some ways you know it when you see it. In some ways you can make a list of things. And to further make this amorphous, I will say that I think another problem is there's too much of a culture of formalism at places. So everyone's very smart, everyone's very rigorous, you're all very analytical, which is why you got into business school, and I did not. So you make checklists of things, and that's great. But sometimes you need to check your gut, not just check a box. And so you have to apply common sense, and you have to think about what the principles of good behavior are that you learned as a child sometimes, and not just do I meet this regulatory requirement to the letter. And I get questions sometimes that are surprising to me. Somebody once asked me at the New York Stock Exchange, we had a group together, and we were talking about issues that boards of directors have to be concerned about. And a very serious person who advises members of boards, which worried me after she asked her question, was, what percentage of time do you think that a member of the board or a C-suite executive should spend thinking about ethical issues? I said, well, that's the dumbest question ever. I didn't say this. I was very polite. It depends. Obviously, if you are part of an organization or a company that has had multiple regulatory actions taken against you, 8 people have been hauled off to prison, and you're being written about every day as a disaster, you should probably spend a lot of time thinking about ethical issues. If, on the other hand, you have a pristine record and you're confident about your systems, you're confident about the people you're hiring, there's been no enforcement action, and you're a model for integrity for everyone else, you can spend proportionally less time. So when you talk about culture, it's part of just keeping your eyes open and your ears open and thinking about what makes sense. And just again, re-emphasizing a point that I think you can't emphasize enough. It's not that different from other business decisions that you make. When, that person never would have asked me. Imagine if somebody asked me the question, or if you got asked the question. Can I ask you, sir, what percentage of time do you think the CEO and the CFO and the other strategic people at a company should be thinking about creativity? Or what percentage of time should be thinking about competition? Well, it depends on how much competition you have. It depends on whether or not you think you're stagnating and you're not being innovative anymore. And the same is true when you're talking about ethical culture. It depends on the circumstances. And I just worry, after doing this for a while, that we have these conversations and it becomes, people always ask me, it becomes about ethics and it becomes about legal policy and it becomes about regulation, when really, if you focus on judgment and you focus on risk and you focus on wisdom and thoughtfulness, that those are the same principles you apply to everything you do. It shouldn't be any different when we're not in some crazy different realm. On Mars, it's the same as everything else. And the more people think about it, not as something that you cabin separately, oh, it's ethics, we gotta talk about the ethics now, or compliance people. It's just like everything else. I think everybody would do a better job.
Great, thank you. Just open it up to the floor if anybody has any questions or how we have the mic system.
Thank you very much for coming and for your wonderful speech. I have a question about C-suite level convictions and jail time. There's been a lot of fuss in the press made that, yes, apart from the Galleon case, that at SAC, Matthew Martoma gets convicted, but you couldn't get Steve Cohen, or Fabulous Fab at Goldman, but you got no one in their C-suite. Do you see that as a problem? Is it something that keeps you up at night? And do you think that it's shifting of moral hazard, that these big firms just pay fines and nobody actually goes to jail, and then they go back doing what they did the next day and the next week?
I don't lose sleep at night. I sleep fairly well. Look, we have a system of law in this country, right? And it's the greatest system. And people get frustrated often if not everybody who they think, without knowing all the facts and circumstances, is not hauled off to prison. And our job always is to hold the highest level person who's involved in any bad conduct or in any institution accountable, if you can. You can't always do that. You can't always do that. I used to do, as I think was mentioned, I used to do Gambino prosecutions and mob prosecutions. It can be difficult to go up the chain and get people to be held accountable if they deserve to be held accountable. And I'm not making an assumption there at all. Is it frustrating sometimes when you think that a person is guilty of a crime and you haven't been able to prove it against them? Yeah, of course. But that's not just so when you're talking about the head of an institution, like the ones you mentioned, if they were guilty of something. It's also true of the person you think is guilty of a murder who's not part of any organization, because you don't have the witnesses. You don't have a cooperating witness, or you don't have a wiretap, or you don't have some other kind of physical evidence. So there's always a frustration there, because you want to do what's right, and you want to hold the right people accountable, and you want to get bad people off the street. So that's how I think about that, and you do the best you can. So from time to time, people say, well, we should lower the standard to make it easier and to take away the requirement that you have a certain mental state. That would be a very dangerous thing, because it wouldn't just make it easier to charge the few people who become poster children for not having been arrested and to get out of jail free cards. It also becomes a prescription for even ethical prosecutors to put a lot of people in prison who maybe acted in good faith or made a mistake or were negligent, but did not have the proper frame of mind or did not have knowledge. Now, there are a lot of people at heads of institutions who are not blameless, even if you can't bring them to court and try them and convict them and send them to prison. And I think that all institutions where there have been failures, there's a level of responsibility and blameworthiness on the part of the management. Because even if they didn't know, they should have known. Now, should have known is not a standard that I'm allowed to employ to send someone to prison for the rest of their lives. So that's just my comment on the nature of the structure of the system and the limitations of a legal system in which you have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt and you have to prove mental state. The second part of your question about whether or not you worry that committing crimes is just a part of doing business. Yeah, you worry about that all the time, which is why you try to make the penalty as stiff as possible, commensurate with the conduct that was committed, the bad conduct that was committed, that will also deter. And it doesn't always work. And I think sometimes people underestimate the value of taking actions that don't necessarily lead to everyone being hauled off away in cuffs. And that is because we have a second interest, not just in holding people accountable and in retribution. We also have an interest in reform and in a different kind of deterrence. So you can take an action against a company like Toyota Motor Corporation, for example, where we levied a $1.2 billion penalty, which was many times more than the Department of Transportation could levy because of how they were playing games with disclosures about safety problems in their cars, and an outside monitor, and a probationary period, and a series of reforms that were enacted at the company so that the next time you're driving a certain kind of car, you can be more assured that there's not a safety problem with it. Now, those things are not always accomplished just by charging somebody. We had a session this morning on Rikers Island. We're taking all these efforts against this prison, which has been a kind of a broken disaster in New York for a number of years now. And we're doing both things. We're bringing cases against individuals who are corrections officers who, among other things, caused inmates to die using excessive unconstitutional use of force against them and sending them to prison. And that's great. And that's holding them accountable and hopefully deterring the next corrections officer from beating the living daylights out of somebody when you're not supposed to do that. Separately, we brought a suit against the city and against the jail system saying that you have to adopt these other institutional reforms, because one of the things that was going on and one of the reasons why people were getting away with these beatings was there were not enough cameras in the jail. And part of what we're hoping to negotiate is the putting in of hundreds and hundreds of more cameras so the corrections officers are going to be less likely to be able to get away with unconstitutional excessive use of force. Now, I can charge as many corrections officers as I want individually and send them to prison. That doesn't put another camera in the ceiling. That doesn't put a camera in the recreational yard. That doesn't put a camera in the medical ward. That requires the institution to take some responsibility and to do some things. And so I've now segued into like my little homily about the issue I take with some people, including a particular judge who sits in my district, who says there is never any value in doing something other than a prosecution of a particular individual. You can do a lot of things and fix a lot of problems by using other tools also.
I have a question about prosecutorial discretion. A lot of professional firms and financial firms cannot live with an indictment. That leaves prosecutors a huge amount of power over them. And I just wonder, what do prosecutors think about in their thinking process in exercising that power? In particular, the destruction of Arthur Andersen came in mind, in which Arthur Andersen went down for a conviction that was later overturned.
Yeah, so I think people need to get over Arthur Andersen a little bit. That was a long time ago, and I think the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction and swinging back a little bit now. For a long time, I would say that people are overstating the risk to the institution from an indictment or a guilty plea. And that doesn't mean you be irresponsible about it, but it turns out to be so. Last year, one of the biggest cases brought in many, many years was my office's case against BNPP, largest bank in France, fourth largest bank in the world. They paid an almost $9 billion fine. They took a guilty plea, and I believe we are not in nuclear winter. I think not only are we not in nuclear winter, the company survives. And it was supposed to survive because we were not trying to kill the bank. Credit Suisse, same thing. I think you'll see that happening a little bit more. Prosecutors are required, should, as a general discretionary matter, and also required to, under Department of Justice guidelines, to pay attention to collateral consequences, because you don't want to cause a company to go out of business that doesn't deserve to go out of business, where hundreds of thousands of shareholders lose value, where 100,000 employees may lose their jobs, as has happened in the past, as you mentioned, unless that's your intent. But there are ways to do that if you're responsible and if you're smart about it. So I'm not revealing any secret, but in connection with the BNPP plea deal, I personally spent, and other people on my team spent a lot of time talking to the Federal Reserve and the Department of Financial Services in New York, and to other regulators, including around the world, in Europe and in Asia, to make sure that everybody understood at the time we took the action and forced the guilty plea, because we thought that was the appropriate result of all sorts of bad money laundering activity that they allowed to go on, and sanctions activity that they allowed to go on. At the end of the day, I think it was a seminal event in corporate prosecutions. We held an entire financial institution accountable, even though people said you couldn't do that. We got a substantial penalty, which is not nothing. I mean, it's not just the cost of doing business, which, $9 billion, even to a bank of that size, is not pocket change. And you get reforms, and you tell every other similarly situated financial institution in the world, you better watch yourself, or this could happen to you also. So to me, it was an achievement of rigorous, tough, but responsible coordination among a lot of different entities, and it's one of the things I'm most proud of, because you can do that, and you can hold people accountable if it's done right.
Thanks again for coming. This is a really interesting conversation. My question is around ethics education, ethics in academia. You said it several times that to be a good person or act on doing the right thing, oftentimes you learn that when you're a kid. something I've recently come to realize, some aha moments for myself, is that a lot of those things haven't been updated since I was 12, 13, 14 years old, what to do to be a good person. So my question is that Stanford has taken some steps to have ethics courses that are a great introduction, but what more do you think should be done or can be done at business school or even before that to really get people to think for themselves what their ethical framework is going to be to make these decisions?
I think the more you can have conversations like this, and the more people can talk about actual scenarios that you might get into. So first you go back to first principles, do the right thing. That doesn't necessarily always provide a lot of guidance unless you can apply it to actual situations that you might be in. I would love to have people talk in the business schools on a more regular basis about what are you going to do the day you're sitting there and you think something bad has happened. Do you tell your wife? Do you go to your shrink? Do you have a cocktail? Do you tell your boss? Do you go to the SEC? What is it that you do? It's not that easy, right? So when we say do the right thing, it sounds glib, but I want to make sure everyone understands that I don't by any means say that doing the right thing is always the easy thing to do, to turn in a friend or to risk scorn from your supervisors and your colleagues is really, really hard. But I think what fortifies you to do that is if you've thought about it in advance. It's like anything else. Cops train before they're in an event where they might be shot at. Troops train, quarterbacks train, and part of the training is to imagine scenarios that you might find yourself in, and not to compare ethical behavior to games. But again, all of being good at something and all of reacting well in a moment that's difficult, where there's adversity, whether it's because the team blitzed and you didn't expect it, or because all of a sudden you think you got the raise because someone thought you were going to do something unethical that you'd never agreed to do. It all requires thinking in advance. It requires strategizing about it in advance, and it requires hearing from other people you trust and respect that you should do something about that when that happens to you. Obviously, you need to do other things, like people need to be educated about what the laws are and what the guidelines are. I don't spend a lot of my time talking about that because you know what? You can call the counsel's office in your firm to figure out what the law should be. We have a lot of regulations in this country, and we have a lot of rules and a lot of policies. But what I think people forget about is the basics, the things you learned when you're a kid. Is it right to do or is it wrong to do? And sometimes if your gut tells you it's wrong to do or it feels fishy to do, but 8 lawyers tell you, well, technically if you do it in this way and you make these disclosures and you stick your head in the sand with respect to these other 3 facts, you could probably get away with it. You should aspire to a higher standard than that.
Yeah, thank you for coming. As a European who come into the US since I was a teenager working in business, I see that actually the reputation sometimes of US companies is I suffer quite a bit. And the issue is when you talk to Germans, for example, there is this kind of uneasiness about the spy scandal and the way that sometimes the kind of US chambers of commerce do not really come out into the world with a really very kind of ethical stance. So in a way, the issue is beyond ethics. It's about reputation of the United States. So my question is, what can one do? What can you do? Because
Me?
actually, you and maybe you with we don't often, I think, hear the President of the United States and other officials put emphasis on how important for the U.S. reputation it is to have good businesses around the world. So I think it's a big issue.
Yeah, I think everyone should talk about reputation, and that goes a little bit beyond than moralizing about do the right thing and everyone's supposed to do the right thing and eat your vegetables. There's a practical consequence, and bad reputation, and I think part of the point of your remarks is that it has a long-term business implication for the companies also, because reputations are affected adversely. So I think, I try to do it. I talk about it in these groups like this. There's not a more influential group going forward than this group, I think. I endorse the idea that people should be talking about these things all the time, and reputations are important.
I think we have time for, 2 more questions? Or 1 more? 1 more question, okay.
So you talked a lot about some of the challenges that arise out of the complexity of financial fraud. And I was wondering, obviously you probably cannot reveal all the information regarding to it, but do you see a lot of connection between the world of finance and the world of organized crime?
You mean structurally, or do you mean actual organized criminals engaging in financial fraud? Because we have both.
Whatever you're allowed
See, from time, look, the mob exists. I get asked questions all the time about the mob, and I used to be a mob prosecutor. The mob is not engaged in as serious violence as I think it used to. I think it got smart. It figured out, like a lot of people, maybe in this room, that you can make money doing, securities work, than you can, doing, fly-by-night extortion schemes against restaurant owners and construction industry people. One of the biggest cases that was brought in my office before I became the U.S. attorney was, I'm forgetting the name of the operation, but there was a lot of people in the mob who were engaged in a penny stock fraud scam. So, wherever there's an opportunity to make money through fraud, or through extortion, or through something else, the mob will figure out a way to make money there, and they think they've done so here. But I don't think it's a huge incursion, but they do some of it. Yeah.
Thank you. Great conversation. I actually wanted to bring up kind of something that ethically bothers me in this situation, where it's really the millions and billions of dollars involved. And you actually touched it on talking about the different companies that you just wanted to be sure that the company survived. But there are three different ways I look at it. One is where the money comes from when the big companies are fined, or even private equity firms, which can come from shareholders, which can come from endowments, pension funds. And is that something you think about in these ethically? The second point is the hundreds of millions of dollars of legal fees that are created through these different prosecutions. And I'm, for instance, thinking about what the press was saying about the Bain Capital, Goldman Sachs settlement, that they settled because they didn't want to pay another 200 million legal fees anyway. And the last one is, how do you think about the ethics of where these billions of dollars of fines go and how they're used? Thanks.
Well, with respect to the third, and I'll try to make it quick because I know we're running out of time, there are two places that they go when you have a federal case. One is, if there are victims, identifiable victims, they go to the victims. And I don't think for a minute or lose 1 second of sleep when we take money from people who, based on their misconduct or their bad conduct, caused thousands of people to lose their entire life savings because of Bernie Madoff. And so I'm very proud of the fact that we've collected, I don't think people would have expected this. I think some people estimate about a $20 billion loss, and some people lost everything that they had. We've collected in excess of 10 or 11 billion dollars. And so every penny of that goes back to the victim. We brought an enormous case against SAIC, SAIC, which is a construction company, development company, because they defrauded the city of New York to the tune of $500 million. And I made them pay every penny back to the city of New York, which they could use to hire firefighters and hire teachers. And so when they're identifiable victims of a crime, you get the money back so you can give it back to the people who lost the money. When you don't have identifiable victims, we don't keep any of the money. It goes to the General Treasury, and Congress decides how that money gets spent. Now, there are various things that you can do, and I think I appreciate the point you're making with respect to whether or not innocent parties are being made to bear the brunt of some of these large fines. I'll quote from what Jim Comey said, who put it best when we brought a case recently, the current FBI director. If the shareholders are upset about that, then the shareholders should do something about it. And the shareholders should not allow companies, you know who should be angrier? I shouldn't be the angry guy. The shareholders should be angry. And the shareholders should be demanding sometimes the heads of the people who are at the top of these institutions who allow the misconduct to happen such that those fines are levied. Because I don't think you're going to find a lot of prosecutors having sympathy for the idea that a lot of, and you can quibble about particular cases and say, well, was this an appropriate fine or not? But if it's the case that people in their good judgment believe that bad conduct happened and there has to be a disgorgement of profit, or there has to be some lesson, that's what's called a penalty, that money has to come from somewhere. Otherwise, the logical extent of the argument of complaint that money is coming from shareholders is that you walk away and do nothing. And then the next time, by the way, there could be a worse action and the shareholders could lose out worse. Or then another bank could decide they're going to engage in the same conduct and there'll be no consequence at all. I mean, we've been talking a little bit about whether or not people think the paying of a certain amount of fine is just a cost of doing business. So I sometimes worry that there are actually people who think in the opposite direction, that there shouldn't even be the cost of doing business. There shouldn't even be a fine because it unduly affects people who may be innocent. Shareholders of companies that continue to engage in bad conduct repeatedly are not innocent in the sense, I mean, they're innocent in the criminal law sense, but they should care about the conduct of business at the institution in a way that they provide the better reforms. It's a good point to end on. Every once in a while, people joke and say that I'm the sheriff of Wall Street, or people in my position are the sheriffs of Wall Street. Really not. There's actually very little that I can do. There's very little that prosecutors can do, because by the time we show up, everything has hit the fan. The companies have gone under. People have been fired. People have been arrested. The real watchdogs who didn't do their jobs in the first place are the reasons that we exist when it comes to financial institutions. The boards of directors didn't do their job. The CEOs didn't do their job. The shareholders didn't get upset. And it is astonishing to me when I hear people who are shareholders of companies who are complaining more about the fine than about the conduct that led to the fine. And I see over and over again when people come in, so don't do this when you represent a company, who come in and say, we really don't deserve the fine, we don't deserve to be prosecuted, we really don't deserve this result. And I say, well, what happened to all the people who were responsible when these bad things, and they'll acknowledge bad things happened, mistakes were made. And so what happened to them? And you know how often I'm told, including with banks whose initials may or may not include, I won't say. You got me on a rant. And I say, what happened to this person? Promoted. What happened to this person? Promoted. Was anybody fired? No. And going back to a point I was making about the disconnect and how we're on Mars when we talk about compliance and enforcement and ethics, as opposed to everything else, it continues to become astonishing to me. You would never say, imagine the board of directors saying to the CEO of a company, well, what happened to that division? We totally screwed up the strategic plan. We are far behind on everything we expected to do, whatever your business is in, and saying, we failed. No one's saying they engaged in criminal activity, but we failed. The people who were in charge failed to have the place act well, and the CEO said, well, they all got promoted. How long would that CEO be in charge? And I see over and over again that there's no consequence internally within the company. And look, I can start taking the position, and some people have suggested that we should start dictating to companies that people get fired and their bonuses get clawed back, and there's some state attorneys general who are thinking about doing this. I don't want to run people's businesses for them, but it is really up to the people in the company in the first instance to be the watchdogs of good behavior there, and then we could do terrorism work and other things that are more fun to do sometimes. But I appreciate your point, but I think there's a lot of blame that goes around, and people need to think really hard about their own roles in either being enablers or passive acceptors of bad conduct that goes on at firms.
Great. Thank you so much, Preet. This is terrific.